Today's topic is going to be the most common strategies for a successful startup. Many of you may have joined some of our webinars in the past, and you'll know that we try to pack as much useful content as we can into the next hour with you, with some of our top faculty that are involved with not only research and teaching here at MIT Sloan, but also in our executive education programs. If you find yourself wanting more after just 60 minutes, I'm pleased to let you know as well that both our faculty today will be offering an open enrollment program that you can join online on November 8th and 9th, Strategies for Startups. And that will give you more time with them, chance to engage in different exercises and really dig deep on this topic. But in the next hour, we do hope that you'll take away some useful and actionable phrases that you'll be able to apply immediately. And we're delighted really to have our two wonderful faculty with us. If we could go to the next slide, it's my pleasure to introduce Erin Scott. Erin is a senior lecturer here at MIT Sloan. She's part of our Technological Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Strategic Management group here at Sloan. Her PhD, as you'll see, involves nearly 2 decades of academic and practical experience to partner with groundbreaking innovators to successfully navigate the entrepreneurial journey from idea to commercialization. She's taught in many of our programs here. She's won awards for her teaching. She's worked closely with Scott Stern as well on the development of the program that I mentioned just a few moments ago. And we're really delighted to have her joining us today. We also have Scott Stern. Scott is the David Sarnoff Professor of Management here at Sloan. He also is really an expert in the field of entrepreneurial strategy. He explores how innovation and entrepreneurship differ from more traditional economic activities and the consequences of these differences for strategy and policy. His research in economics of innovation and entrepreneurship focus on entrepreneurial strategy, innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystems, and innovation policy and management. He's worked extensively with practitioners in both the academic and the entrepreneurship and startup world, including advising startups and other growth firms in the areas of entrepreneurial strategy. In recent years, Scott has developed a popular new Sloan elective, Entrepreneurial Strategy. He's co-founded the Regional Entrepreneurship Accelerator Program and has advised the development of Social Progress Index and served as the lead MIT investigator on the U.S. Cluster Mapping Project. There's more that you'll see on both of their biographies, but I hope by now you realize that they are experts in this field and are delighted to be joining you today to share some of their thoughts and research and hopefully some helpful takeaways. Speaking of that, what we'll cover today, we'll be going over some of the most critical choices startups face and how to use the entrepreneurial strategy compass to see how those key choices fit together as part of an overall strategy. If any of you have been to our programs here at Sloan, you know that we're very much not just about teaching, but we're about the application of knowledge and action learning. And the entrepreneurial strategy compass is a tool that you'll be able to use in the application of your work in the startup ecosystem. We'll also cover an overview of the 4 strategies for startups that comprise the entrepreneurial strategy compass and a coherent and actionable framework for choosing and implementing startup strategy. If you do have any questions throughout the program, please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A tab. We're trying to reserve some time at the end of our hour today to answer most of your questions. So without any further ado, let me turn it over, I believe, to Scott to get us started.
Very, very good. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Julie and Elaine and Christine for supporting this. And we're just delighted to be here with you all to really focus in on essentially strategy for startups. Just kind of before I even get started, it's great seeing people from all over the world. We'd be really excited to dig in with this with you a few months from now during the 2-day. And this is just to give you a little bit of a taste of the type of work that Erin and I have been working on as we work with startups, as we kind of look at that both systematically across, as part of large scale data studies, but even more so working with individual startups to bring their ideas to impact. Erin. Great. And so we always start this, we're at MIT and we are privileged here at MIT to really be part of an ecosystem in which people are coming up with great ideas all the time. We see anything from Moderna to BioBot to companies in various and different spaces. And one of the things that kind of at the core that we initially recognized is the challenge of entrepreneurship, of bringing ideas to impact, is not only about coming up with those ideas, but it's choosing how to implement those ideas, to choose and implement a strategy around those ideas in a way that creates and captures meaningful value. So just to kind of ground ourselves in this, this here is Michael Martin and Nick Korolick. Michael was actually a student at the Harvard Business School. Nick was a student here over in the engineering school in the PhD program. And Michael and Nick, this is almost 10 years ago now, were sort of kind of collaborating together, kind of really working on solving what they perceived to be a big problem they wanted to solve, which at that time was the fact that emergency response, our 911 system, really wasn't designed for the mobile age. Next slide. Right? Instead, right, actually, even though we could kind of order Uber for a quick quick ride, or we could order a taco to our offices, actually, when you needed it most, at the most critical times in your life, actually, it was a system that was working on 512 bytes that didn't take advantage of any of the information inside of your mobile phone, didn't draw information from your watch or video or whatever it might be. And working together, Mike and Nick were able to sort of see both a technical path, making, right, kind of a core technology, and to sort of start transforming that system and start embracing mobile first emergency response. But of course, once they got started, next slide, right? Right, this maybe, yeah, right? Once they got started, once they started kind of pursuing and kind of exploring their idea, their problem was that they couldn't think of too few things to do. The problem was that they saw almost a blizzard of paths forward. So on the one hand, when they appeared in our 100K competition, and Michael's a very effective presenter, they started getting a lot of inbound traffic from industry, most notably from Motorola, a key dominant and established industry player in this space. And certain of their advisors said, you know what? Nick's a great engineer. Here you are in Cambridge. Why don't you focus on technology collaboration with already existing companies? They got separate calls. They got separate contact, sort of started working the potential for the application of this in the insurance industry. No one really likes their insurance app. Insurance companies want it to be value added. This could save lives, reduce costs, enhance customer engagement, right? Really something valuable. And so different insurance companies called them up and said, why don't you partner with us in a kind of collaborative problem solving way? And we'll see how we can integrate something like what would become Rapid SOS into the domain of our insurance industry applications. As well, there was a group of burning platform groups. They might have had less money than the insurance industry or Motorola. They weren't quite as established. But these were groups, advocacy groups, for whom emergency response was not a sideline, but a central day-to-day concern. A central day-to-day concern. Whether or not it's the American Epilepsy Society, domestic violence organizations, American Heart Association, these groups sort of kind of said, the people we represent, our constituents, our stakeholders, deeply care about this, and we feel the pain of this problem on an ongoing basis. They didn't have as much money, but they had an urgent need around it. And finally, when Mike and Nick, after they graduated, went around Silicon Valley, people said, "Oh, we get what this is. This is kind of Uber for ambulances. Why don't we kind of separately contract away from traditional emergency response? And why don't we figure out how to basically provide the service and then have the government pay for it? We can just kind of replace the entire system. We can architect an entire new emergency response around this new innovation. Next slide. And essentially, when you think about those different paths, right? Each of them, many people here, and you can even feel free to kind of throw in the chat, you might have a view that one path makes complete sense and others less so, but there'll be other people on the Zoom, and it wouldn't matter how much time we took. Each of those paths was a potential path forward. When you have a fundamentally good idea, you're going to be able to see multiple ways of implementing it. Entrepreneurial strategy is how we choose, is the choice among alternative paths for an idea and a company. Next slide. Okay. And so essentially, at the core of the work that Erin and I have done along with collaborators is how can a startup make choices to accelerate when they confront many options, when they can see multiple path forwards, but of course they face a high level of uncertainty. Right? Our core collaborator in this is Joshua Gans from the University of Toronto. We have a book that's coming out actually this January, Entrepreneurship from Norton. And at the core of that book, we kind of synthesize 3 key principles to drive your most critical choices as an entrepreneur. That your choices matter, that very often this isn't about kind of choosing the banner color on the website. It isn't about a sort of sideline. Is kind of usually you're going to have multiple paths forward, can't do everything. You face a lot of uncertainty and it's hard to learn. And so how do we integrate a meaningful program of critical experimentation so we can make the choices to not only identify the idea, but scale it in a meaningful way? And then we apply that idea of choice matters to particular domains. How do we choose our customers? Of course, our customers have to choose us, but we as well as entrepreneurs are choosing our customers. How do we choose among different technical paths? How do we choose our technology? How do we choose and build our team, both our co-founders, our early joiners, and other stakeholders? And ultimately, how do we choose our competition? And then how do those choices come together as part of an overall entrepreneurial strategy? Next slide. Okay. And just maybe one more. Okay. What I'm going to do is kind of start in take a little bit of a moment to take a little moment to kind of think about how we choose our competition. And that's going to give us kind of going to motivate and give us a framework for thinking about this entrepreneurial strategy compass that Rob talked about at the beginning of the webinar. Next slide. And so to kind of think about that, what we do is we sort of say, Erin often says, there's only one way to guarantee that no one will compete with you, and that's to pursue a poor idea and implement it poorly. Right? If you have no customers, don't worry, you won't get a lot of competition there. But if you are pursuing something meaningful, as a founder, you of course have to provide compelling value to customers. You want to leverage innovation, you want to build your organization, but you're also going to be in an environment where ultimately you will face some form of competition. And so what we're going to try to do is organize kind of not so much whether or not you face competition, but with whom you compete, make a choice about with whom you might compete and how to compete. So here are 2 great former students, Elliot Cohen and TJ Parker. Elliot was an MBA here at Sloan, and Elliot and TJ actually were some of the founders of our Hacking Medicine kind of initiative at MIT, which has separately had its own impact. And as participants in Hacking Medicine, they came up with a fundamentally good idea. They saw a real pain point and came up with a solution in the area of pharmacy. For those of you who take multiple medications or have parents who might take multiple medications, you know that can be just incredible hassle. You know, people kind of sitting there with all sorts of bottles, not quite sure what to take when. Instead, right, rather than have to sort of sort through all your multiple medications, remember many different types of instructions, PillPack was founded on the idea that pharmacy should just work. You should be able to just open up a packet that says at 8 a.m. on Sunday, take these pills, no more need to worry about it. And that was a very poor idea. We actually worked closely with Elliot and TJ when they got, just when they were getting started, in particular, both when Elliot was a student here, and then as they were kind of launching their entrepreneurial journey. I actually wrote a kind of detailed case, and right at the beginning, they realized that they got some advice, right, from key advisors who were very well-intentioned that said, you have a big driver of value in the pharmacy space. You should go talk to the big established pharmacies. You will kind of compete with other startups who are seeking to work with those big pharmacy chains. But fundamentally, right, you're going to be the kind of firm that essentially drives value in cooperation with the established players in the industry. Other advisors, right, also well-intentioned, said, you know what? Actually, CVS has, there's lots of challenges into getting in there. They might not have the same interest as you or the same passion for this problem. You should do is go serve the customer directly. And by serving the customer directly, you're going to be able to really test out and experiment and see that you really meaningfully can create value. Of course, that does put you in competition with CVS. It also comes with a lot of challenges because, for example, to implement that competition strategy, you're going to need to set up a pharmacy. You'll get a pharmacy license and actually run have a physical pharmacy location in every one of the 50 states of the United States. Cooperation or competition. Given their limited resources, couldn't really play around with doing both. Interestingly, they ultimately chose the competition route. They were ultimately acquired after about 5 years by Amazon for about $1 billion. Interestingly, on the day they were acquired by Amazon for $1 billion, ultimately becoming Amazon Pharmacy, the stock market capitalization of CVS and Walgreens, the competitors, actually was reduced by $8 billion. Think about that. Next slide. So one dimension is the choice between cooperation on the one hand, right? Competing to kind of get into the established value chain, or competing with exactly those firms you otherwise would have cooperated. A second dimension is how to compete. We're here at MIT. Some companies, they are grounded in an orientation and investments that are about protecting their idea, intellectual property, trade secrecy, really creating proprietary architecture that no one can touch. On the other hand, right, for many startups, they find that extremely challenging. You go much slower. It's a kind of requires an orchestration and a clarity about exactly what you need to protect even before you start the business. Before you do that really important amount of learning and experimentation. Here's Bael Kutakia. She was actually a former student here at Sloan. Actually, was an undergrad. She was working in New York, and her entrepreneurial journey is, I think, really one of the most ambitious. She was frustrated with her job in corporate America. She decided that she would give herself 2 weeks to both essentially come up with an idea and see if it would work. And that seems pretty ambitious for most of us, but she put a tremendous amount of initiative into it. And her pain point, her own personal pain point, was that she liked to go to the gym, go dance classes, spin classes, things like that. And she was frustrated that she either had to buy a single gym membership, pay in a complicated way, or sort of overpay for daily memberships, and she couldn't kind of use gyms and go to classes on an as-needed basis. And with that one insight about how to connect gyms and studios and things like that to customers, that became the kernel behind ClassPass. Now, interestingly, she was told at the time that, well, that's a great idea. Everyone agreed it was a really good idea. It was definitely a hole in the marketplace. It was also something where lots of people could compete. There's going to be a lot of imitators very quickly. You have nothing proprietary. And she said, that's okay, because I'm going to go a little bit. I've gotten a head start here. I'm going pretty fast, and I'm going to get ahead, and I'm going to stay ahead. And she was able then to establish a rhythm of learning and experimentation, of feedback for that company that ultimately allowed her to scale ClassPass to the right to ultimately an IPO. Interestingly, there were in fact many imitators to ClassPass, but even within that category, she was able to establish the lead position and maintain it through rapid experimentation and learning. Once again, one part that we kind of go through in the course and in our work is, once again, the choice that the entrepreneur faces is essentially between, are we more focused on controlling the core idea and just kind of excluding others from the market, or are we really focused on execution, iteration, and learning, which might actually encourage more competition, more allow for others to kind of also be in the space, but also allows us to move more quickly, nimbly, and agilely. And together, next slide, that's going to come, what we do is we then put those two dimensions of competition into an overall entrepreneurial strategy compass. This is not a map, this is a compass. You and your ideas are at the center. And essentially along the x-axis, what we think about is that choice between collaboration and competition. On the y-axis, on the vertical axis, is the choice between control and execution. Just next slide. And then we bring that together in our work on strategy for startups into the overall entrepreneurial strategy compass. Starting in the middle, where you are with your ideas, you can go up and to the left and think about control and cooperation, and we'll call that intellectual property strategy. Alternatively, we can think about exactly managing this differently, making different choices around competition and execution. That's what we call a disruption strategy. Still work with the big firms, but do so in a way that is much more execution oriented. That's part of being part of the value chain, a value chain strategy. Or we could think about that most ambitious strategy, control and compete. Hard to do for a startup. And that's where you're really architecting an entirely new value chain yourself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass it off to my great colleague, Aaron Scott. He'll take you forward from there to dig into our work on the entrepreneurial strategy compass.
Great. Thank you, Scott. So what we wanted to do today was give you a little bit more context of these different strategies for startups, the most successful strategies for startups that we see, and what are those underlying choices. Then tell you a little bit more about the course, and then open it up to questions. And so the first one that Scott mentioned, the first strategy for startups, is the intellectual property strategy. This is the thinker's strategy, the ideas factory strategy. And we've actually already seen this, as we've discussed, Rapid SOS's choice, when Scott told you that one way they could have gone was to be that ideas factory, that R&D intensive organization that then licensed out to the Motorola's of the world, who then brought those forward to their final customers. And so the idea here for an intellectual property strategy is to really focus on creating value through collaboration with these established players, but by heavily controlling the intellectual property that you have. And then you kind of, in this market for ideas, bring that together. And so a key part here is that you want to be able to deliver value for the existing users of your partner organization. And you want to develop your technology in a way that really integrates as a component that can integrate into their systems. And you do this through an organization that's heavily focused on that intellectual know-how and that deal making. And this is really underlies the hypothesis about how your organization is going to create value and capture value. And we've seen so many examples of this in the marketplace of how our lives are much better because of organizations that have collaborated to bring their innovations to market. Perhaps most famously is Dolby, an incredibly successful organization that actually, if you go back into Dolby's early days, he committed very early on to never build a product himself, in part so that he could partner with among the leaders in the industry to bring his groundbreaking, or his organization's groundbreaking innovations to the market in a range of different spaces. And so he heavily protected his patents and his intellectual property and enforced his contracts. He was not afraid to call the lawyers in. But he also wanted to do something that really created this win-win, that his partner's organization created more value for their customers. And this is the hallmark of an intellectual property strategy. But quite different on that other side of the axis, as Scott talked about, where we're going to focus on competing through execution. This is the disruption strategy. This is one of the most, I would say, common strategies for startups that people often talk about. This is about creative destruction. This is about hustlers. And this is what Scott was talking about when he was talking about ClassFast. It's let's get out there, let's get ahead and stay ahead. And the key part of this is we're going to leverage some new innovation, some new technological trajectory to really discover value for new users. And we're going to have that full integrated capabilities to deliver that in a way that creates this new value, and it allows us ultimately to compete with the established players. But a key part here is we're not going to, from day one, go head-to-head in competition with them. What we're going to do is we're going to start with an underserved or poorly served customer group that's not being well served by the established players. We're going to leverage that entry point to learn and improve and continue to iterate and slowly expand the customer segments that we serve until ultimately we are head-to-head with the established players. This is the playbook of Rent the Runway and Salesforce. It's a very well-established set of tools, but really requires a set of cohesive choices to really make this work. Similarly, there's a value chain strategy. A value chain strategy also relies heavily on execution, that get ahead, stay ahead that Scott talked about. But in this case, from a disruption strategy, instead of focusing on competition, we're going to focus on collaboration with the established players. And so the key point here in a value chain strategy is we want to insert ourselves into the established value chain and create more value for that entire value chain. And so the idea here is that you're going to work with your partner to discover a new value for their existing users. So you're never, in fact, going to touch the final customer here, but you're working with them to iterate, to discover these new technologies, new ways to enhance value for their customers. And this is heavily focused on really building a team that's best in class in that one slice of the value chain. And so we see this in a number. Oftentimes we as consumers may be less aware of these types of strategies because we don't necessarily see them because they are not touching the final customer. But in many ways, they are enhancing the value of our established value chains. And a value chain strategy is among the most common strategies for startups and can be quite successful for the entrepreneurs and for the ecosystem players. And so what you're going to do here is orient towards collaboration and invest in execution. And the idea here is to bring to market the best solution for a segment, again, through this partner organization. But a key component here is that you want to be selective in really finding partners that have a reputation for treating startups fairly and well. And this is, again, one we've already seen when Scott was talking about Rapid SOS, is that it could have worked with insurance partners to really help enhance value for the insurance company's clients by improving their ability to call 911 in emergencies. The last strategy for startup is the architectural strategy. This is among the most ambitious strategy for startups. This is, as Scott is talking about, is architecting an entirely new value chain, maybe reorganizing the pieces or bringing together entirely new pieces to create that value chain. This is the builders, the 0 to 1. This is leveraging some new technology, some new innovation to deliver value through new users. And this requires a lot of really early commitments understanding how you might create that new value and understanding what parts you want to invest in controlling so you can also capture some of that value. And so this requires really this ambitious commitment and resource intensive exercise to leverage integrated resources to build out this new value chain to then compete with the established value chain. This is what Scott was talking about with Rapid SOS and really building out that entirely new system for emergency response. We also see this in many different flavors. One of the common ways that we see architectural strategies these days, it's not the only one, but one of the most common is in platform strategies, such as OpenTable or other platforms that we see online. These are about really orienting to this competition, but again, really protecting what is that core component that really controlling that platform. And so what you're going to do as an architect is through that control, you're going to create this entirely new value chain with multiple stakeholders to provide that compelling value to that end user. But again, you have to focus on really controlling that core resource that allows you to continue to really bring forward that value in that new ecosystem. And so, we go in the course in a much more deeper way into each of these different strategies for startups. Each of these involve different sets of choices around customer, around technology, around organization, and of course, competition. And again, as Scott mentioned, but just really emphasize, is this is not saying your idea is in a certain space, therefore you should follow a certain strategy for startup. This is a compass. You and your idea are center stage, and we find for good ideas that most entrepreneurs are able to really see, just as we saw with Rapid SOS, at least 3 or 4 different alternative paths that reflect these different strategies for startups. And these different strategies involve these different choices and these different hypotheses about how they're going to create and capture value. And then an entrepreneur needs to sit back and think about, how can I learn more about these different paths before I make a choice as to which direction to go forward? And first part of that is really understanding the different priorities and commitments involved in these different strategies. And so just at a high level, really think about the difference between a value chain strategy, working with an insurance partner, for instance, at Rapid SOS, versus a disruptive strategy where we might really engage with the American Heart Association or other customers directly. A value chain strategy really early on requires you to really focus on integrating your innovation into an existing value chain. That means you really need to understand that value chain and how you're going to create value for them, how you're going to reinforce that value proposition that already exists, and really maintain and build that relationship with your partner organization, building that trust and building that really specialized knowledge within your startup. That's a bit different from a disruption strategy where we're going to really think about how we create this novel value and focus not on the customers that are already well served, but in fact, those that are poorly served by the existing value chain. And in a disruption strategy, we're really going to focus on execution, learning, and continuing to iterate and improve to ultimately compete with the partners that we might have chosen in a value chain strategy. So you can see very quickly, not only in our early choices, but also what success looks like in the long term, that these different strategies for startups are really about different choices for what our organization and success will look like. And so how do we think about starting to learn and understand these different trade-offs specific to the idea that we're considering so that we can ultimately make an active choice? And the key part of that is really thinking about those early experiments that you can do, those early entrepreneurial experiments. And while we want to test all of our ideas, all of the components of our ideas, we can't, we're constrained and there's only so many things we can test. And so how do we think about those tests, those trade-offs? The first is we want to test our most critical assumptions. What must be true for this idea and this strategies to succeed? The next is we want to think about the fidelity of those experiments. Some things that are critical that must be true to succeed, we just won't be able to test in a way that actually gives us information that will allow us to drive our choices. And so we want to think about among, let's say, those top 5 things that must be true for this to succeed, which ones can we think of actionable experiments that will help us learn and ultimately make a choice? And then last, we want to think about the opportunity cost involved in running these different experiments. And this involves not only the time for you as a startup team, but the time, the money, the other resources, but also the strategic commitments that may be involved in running these experiments. Is it truly an experiment or is it just starting down one path? And so we can, while an ideal experiment, test a critical hypothesis with high fidelity and low opportunity cost, we all live in the real world. We know there are trade-offs. And so an entrepreneur really must decide how they are going to weigh these to really learn about these different paths and make a choice forward. And so one of our favorite examples of a founder who was very thoughtful in choosing this process of experimentation and learning to ultimately make a choice as to their strategy and their path forward for their venture was Vera Wang. So many of us know Vera Wang. She came up with the idea for the modern wedding dress. while shopping for her own wedding dress while working at Ralph Lauren. She had an excellent job as a designer at Ralph Lauren. And she knew that there was this opportunity in this market for dresses for the more modern woman. And, she made one, big choice, which was to leave her job at Ralph Lauren, but she didn't immediately jump into Vera Wang Bridal. In fact, what she did was she launched a high-end bridal shop on Fifth Avenue in New York. And she filled it, interestingly, with most of the dresses that were, her target market. And what were those established were buying? And what she did was she, in fact, had one dress of her own design in those early days. And that allowed her to learn a lot. She got to see who pulled out that dress, who was interested, who put it back, what did they buy when they didn't buy her dress, what was said. And then slowly she started putting in more and more of her own designs as she really learned and iterated, such that by the time she launches Vera Wang Bridal, she understood a lot about her customer, her target customer, both the beachhead and where she wanted to go, but she'd also integrated that learning into her designs and the aesthetic of Vera Wang, which then expanded not only to Vera Wang Bridal, but also the Vera Wang formal wear and even the homeware. And so this process of experimentation and learning is really important, and really something we're going to emphasize in the course is how can you slowly escalate the commitments you're making so that you can integrate that learning into the choices you're making about how you're going to create value for your customer and the strategy and the path you're going to go forward to ultimately build your venture. And this is going to underlie this decision rule that we're going to talk about at length and really put to work the entire second day of the course, which is test 2, choose 1, which is we're going to take these process of experimentation and learning to help us understand these different paths, the trade-offs that are involved, the choices, the commitments that we're going to need to make. And then we want to surface at least 2 different strategies that seem viable, much like we saw with Mike and Nick with Rapid SOS, is really surfacing those alternative paths, understanding those trade-offs, and only then do we want to make a choice as to which path we want to go forward, one that ultimately reflects the path that we want and the organization and venture that we want to build. And so we go back to Michael and Nick. This was very much the process they went through. So, these choices that Scott talked about were very much the choices at hand when they were sitting there. And they understood that these were different strategies for their startup. This involved a different set of activities for the next 6 months, and ultimately a different type of success and a different way in how they wanted to move forward. And having done some experiments to really understand what these different paths look like, and the trade-offs and what activities they would need and what other stakeholders like investors and otherwise they would need to engage. They then step back. So this is us working with them in those early days. And they step back and they then went around that room and they said, what do we want to do? What is the company that we want to build? And all of these were great options. And ultimately, they looked at these different strategies. And they decided to start in that disruption strategy, really working with the American Heart Association and other organizations like that, to really understand what was needed. Because it turns out, while most of us only call 911 every 5 years, for those patient groups, in epilepsy, heart association, and similar, often call, on a far more regular basis. And they had this pressing need to really solve this problem. Through that, they were ultimately able to build out and make sets of choices to really build out a deep solution in this space. And ultimately, now, if you are to pick up your Android or iPhone in front of you, if you're in the United States, as well as in several other countries, is in fact Rapid SOS, who is in fact powering that ability for the location and other information on your phone to be sent to 911. And they continue to innovate in this space, serving as a partner for emergency response and continuing to innovate in this space. And that ultimately meant that they had, you talked to Nick and Michael about their choices. really they talk a lot about that they required in those early days a lot of focus as to which path they were going to go on to really build this at scale. And so before we open it up to questions, I want to talk to you a bit more about this course. In the 2 days, what we're going to do is take you on very much this path, both on these core domains of choice, as well as spend the entire second day going through these different strategies for startups and putting it to work on real life cases, much like the Rapid SOS case, such that you leave with an actionable framework for the development and implementation of a strategy for your idea in dynamic environments. As well, really focusing in a deeper way on the type of experiments that you can do, both to help you learn about those alternative strategies, but also once you've chosen a strategy, how can you continue to do experimentation that allows for successfully scaling an entrepreneurial venture? And so we've had a great time in this course in the past with a range of different ecosystem players, from entrepreneurs ready to go, those launching and scaling their ventures, but also startup employees, corporate entrepreneurs, investors, and those wanting to just bring a startup mentality to their life. This 2 days, we focus, like I said, on those early choices and some processes we have to put in place and thinking about those choices, going through them with real cases. And then the second day is entirely these different strategies for startups and using those different tools. A key part, and we hope that you've kind of seen this a little bit here as we've introduced this, is that the power of entrepreneurship is the ability to not only identify and really, implement these exciting opportunities, but to make choices that allow you to really create real value for the world and capture value for your stakeholders. And a key part of this is understanding these different pathways and then making an active choice. And that often involves leaving behind really good options, really good strategic paths to ultimately choose the path forward for you. And so this really involves you as an entrepreneur coming to terms with the type of venture that you want to create. And so this is really the heart of our decade worth of entrepreneurial strategy research and practice with thousands of entrepreneurs. So we're really looking forward to another great 2-day session and seeing many of you in that course. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure we had plenty of time to answer questions from folks here online. And thank you so much for joining us from around the globe. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob to help us kind of go through some of the questions that have been answered. And if folks have more questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Scott. What a wonderful job of taking so much rich material and being able to cover it in such a short time. Really appreciate your efforts and how you kind of also gave some insight in terms of what the program looks like, spending 2 days with both of you online for the participants to be able to work with you, to work with each other, and really have a much deeper experience as well. You can see, I know in the chat box, many of you have been asking for dates and price. You can see the slide now that has the dates. You're able to scan the QR code for more information on the program. We'd certainly be delighted to have you join us. We often run this program on campus here in Cambridge in Kendall Square, but in November, we will be running the program online. So you don't need to travel. You can participate fully from your home or your office, wherever you're located. And we've designed these programs to really be very engaging. There'll be different functions that you'll have in the program, such as breakout groups where you'll be working with other participants, engaging with the faculty directly. So we think there's a real benefit in being able to reach a much wider geographical range by offering these programs online, and this next program, in fact, will be so. So we hope that might encourage you to participate as well. Jumping into the questions, I see that Scott has been answering many of the questions in the Q&A, so we may come back to some of those. And of course, if anybody has additional questions, feel free to submit those to the Q&A, and we'll try to get to all of them, time permitting. One question, though, that comes to mind, probably, Scott, if you don't mind tackling this one, we often, from time to time, we'll hear of a successful entrepreneur that said, I just rolled up my sleeves and just got started. I just jumped in and really kind of adjusted on the fly or as I went in founding a company or a startup. But why, from your perspective, is it important for entrepreneurs to choose a strategy in advance and not take that kind of just jump in and go approach?
Yeah. And so first, I mean, obviously, entrepreneurship is action, right? Entrepreneurs engage in action and are action oriented, both by nature and by, in some sense by their imperative of what they're trying to do. But we're not saying that you should sit around and take 5 years and hire McKinsey and do a 7-year plan. But what we have found, and Aaron, I think, really went through it nicely, is that crystallizing, are there some meaningful paths forward? How does any given path forward, how does that relate to what I'm going to be doing in the innovation area and the customer and financing? And how does that relate to where the ecosystem I'm currently in? Does that all kind of gel together? And so that I can imagine what a good day is going to look like, what some of the challenges are so I can address them. And so I can use that action orientation sharply, smartly. Entrepreneurs work hard. You wouldn't be joining this webinar unless you're working hard, have a lot of hustle. But the question is, how do we use that hustle smart? And there's, as I mentioned very briefly in the Q&A, it's a little hard to know, kind of starting, across all the entrepreneurs in the world, how many of them are proactive, how many of them just, kind of do by happenstance. But a number of careful studies, both by collaborators of ours, but also more broadly, as well as really when you look in practice, if you see kind of different alternatives, the kind of programs, for example, within accelerators, or even what venture capital has emphasized for their firms, that ultimately highly impactful startups are associated with coherent strategy. There's good evidence for it academically. It's grounded in our best practice. And, it's very complementary, I think, to the work of Bill Allott and disciplined entrepreneurship here that we talk a lot about at Sloan. It's complementary to experience of the companies that we work with, and we've seen it work in practice.
Thank you for that. So now shifting to some of the open questions in the Q&A box. Aaron, maybe you can tackle this next one. How should financial considerations influence use of the compass? For example, revenue potential, required capital expenditures, probable operating margins, etc.
Thanks, Rob. This is such a great question. If we think about those different strategies, different strategies are going to require different sets of resources to really get started and build at scale. And so entrepreneurs absolutely need to think about those financial considerations. What ecosystem resources are you going to be able to access? What financial resources are you going to be able to access? And so just, for one way of thinking that is, an architectural strategy is the most ambitious strategy for startup. It also involves a lot of early commitments and that really ability to build at scale. And so this is often a strategy that really requires early and deeply committed venture capital investors, for instance. And if that is going to be difficult for you to access, then that's not the choice that you want to make. You don't want to make those trade-offs to accept venture capital investment or large-scale venture capital investment, then you might want to consider a different strategy for startup. As well, just in a different way of thinking about it is often, different strategies, those first 12 months, those first 18 months are very different. And so, for instance, if you're going to go through an intellectual property strategy or even a value chain strategy where you're working with an established player, there's a lot of payoff potential to really having that partnership and to creating a lot of value with them. But you as a startup are working on the corporate partner's timeline. It's going to take time to get that initial meeting to convince them that you as a startup not only have that great idea, but also have that ability to deliver on that idea in partnership with them. And then it may take a few more meetings and you got to meet with the decision maker and the different components within that organization. And if you as a startup need to start generating revenue very quickly, those delays, might be difficult. Versus a disruption strategy where you might be able to start getting a product out a bit more quickly, maybe even bootstrap a little bit early on. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't alternatives that can allow you to really balance this if you have financial considerations, but they are different. And then I'd make one other point, which is, one thing we've also really emphasized in the course and in our broader work is you want to choose stakeholders that understand the path that you're going on. If you choose investors and their playbook is an architectural strategy, but you want to build a disruption, then you're going to constantly have that kind of tension and different tactics and different advice that you're getting. And so just understanding the different models of your ecosystem resources and making sure everyone is aligned is incredibly important.
Great, thank you for that. Next question from the audience. Would it be wise to move through the Compass strategies according to the company's stage, maturity, growth, and scalability? Or are these considered to be more of a static-based strategy?
Yeah, so great question, and something we covered actually towards the end of day 2 in the course, kind of thinking about sequencing, thinking about transition, thinking about kind of how you set yourself up for a potential strategic pivot from one to the other over time. With that said, we've been able to map out for lots of companies or these kind of strategic moves, and there's no one true path. There's no one precise sequence that works for all startups. We see companies sometimes start in competition, maybe that bootstrapping disruption that Aaron talked about, and then ultimately, though, they land in a more cooperative place. Once again, that requires a strategic pivot at that point, right? Because now they're cooperating with those they used to compete with. We also see people start with those collaboration. Maybe they kind of benefits from, they get deep experience in the industry, they understand some important customer groups, and then they ultimately are able to use the team they're building there to ultimately scale to a broader enterprise. What we do see, though, is the importance of coherence and doing a little bit, not planning, but let's call it that proactive kind of thinking about what those pivots look like. If you start building your team to be very deeply within the value chain of existing, then it's going to be ever harder to kind of shift over to the other strategy and vice versa. And so what we often talk, both in the companies we work with, the work that we've done in this area, and the material that we cover, we sort of talk about kind of where you start with your idea and your company, and the path that you choose ultimately shapes what you end up prioritizing and also what your strategic options are going forward.
Great, thank you. So I think both of you will appreciate this next question being kind of the MIT data-driven culture, and also with all the extensive research you've done, not only with your teaching, but with your upcoming book. Is there data supporting probability of success for a startup of one strategy versus another?
Aaron, I'm sure, do you want me to take the lead on that? Or yeah, okay. So interestingly, and we've kind of thought about this for many years with both our own quantitative studies in this area, and also what has become 25 years ago, there was very little work, academic research on what drives startup success. It was just a real kind of not really a field. A bunch of us, including Aaron, but as well some of the work that myself and Josh have done, got that work started and really kind of thought about what could we know, and basically looked at, eventually thousands and thousands of companies, understood their strategies and looked at them and looked at ultimate success factors. I'll highlight 2 things. The first is that the dominant finding from all that type of research, it is much more important to be coherent than to have, quote unquote, the right strategy. For a given idea, there are multiple paths forward. It's very rare that we find a company that is so narrowly constrained near the time of its founding that there's only one path forward. In fact, and this relates to another question, it's precisely because you have a good idea. The test of a good idea is that you can see multiple paths forward. You can see many ways it can work. That's the nature of a good idea. With that said, we've undertaken a bunch of studies, and actually, just to be clear, I'll give you one example. We had looked at one study where we looked basically at things coming out of universities that were jointly developed by faculty and students. Sometimes the faculty joined the student startup, other times the students did it all by themselves. Not surprisingly, the students, they're quick, they get to things, they were much less IP oriented, just got ahead, stayed ahead. They brought the products to market quicker. They got the firms established faster. They got their first round of finance more quickly. Faculty startups, much more IP, but much slower, like literally 18 months slower. Then we look 7 years later, average valuation, almost exactly the same. What's interesting is that both plans could work. They were grounded very much in differences in who was in the startup and what they prioritized at what strategy would make sense at their point in career, at what impact they wanted to have.
Erin, any thoughts you'd like to add?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we see this in so much of the data, and so much in talking and working with different startups is that these different paths are viable, but it's being consistent and coherent in those bundles of choices as you move forward. And so, that's just, it's hard to see and when you're looking first at it, but it's something that really comes to life, both in the data and in conversation with startups. And I think this point that good ideas by their nature are going to have more paths to success is incredibly important. And that means this importance of choice and that importance of really being coherent in your choices and staying true to that as you sequence and scale up your startup is incredibly important. But that doesn't mean we stay on the sidelines. That means we're just thoughtful in our path to action.
Great, thank you. We're nearing the top of the hour, and I feel it would be remiss of me not to ask at least one question about AI, since that seems to be kind of dominating so many topics in business and business schools and business publications. Any thoughts in the short time that we have left from either of you in terms of AI, generative AI, ChatGPT, as a resource or impact it may have on entrepreneurs as they approach choosing the right strategy?
So fortunately, we've been in the, so first, completely agree, Rob, that there's tremendous opportunity there. Interestingly, we've actually been doing a lot of work in kind of actually using, using a kind of an app that sort of lets us kind of actually run through the strategy, run through strategies and test for coherence. And so some of our colleagues, some of our academic colleagues are working on that right now. And one insight that I would say is that you have to be thoughtful about it. So specifically, if you just ask, what should the startup do to a ChatGPT, they'll give you an answer, but it'll tend to give you an average, not particularly coherent. It'll kind of take a little bit from everything. That'll be a single prompt. On the other hand, if you take a gentle kind of prompted a few more times and say, what would it look like if I focused on control and cooperation? It'll tend to identify, or at least test your, kind of give you some, kind of pointers and kind of test, give you some sparks to think about what an IP strategy looks like. Similarly, if you say, oh, I'm really a hustler, I really want to, I don't want to really focus around patents or blah, blah, blah. I want to look at disruption. And so what we have found is that that ChatGPT or an LLM is extremely unlikely to choose your strategy for you, but that as in many things, that large language models are going to be one more tool we have to drive that action-oriented decision-making.
Thank you, Scott. And Erin, I saw you were nodding your head in agreement as well. Any other thoughts from you in terms of AI in this space?
Absolutely. It's really an exciting time. And, I would echo everything that Scott said. It's really, we're seeing a lot of using it to really push your thought forward on different strategies, but also a lot on really ideation. I saw a few questions in the chat about how do we think about refining our ideas and iterating and really focusing them. And there's a lot of great work and a lot of experiments that we're seeing on just really refining your ideas, as well as experiments and ways to prototype so much faster. To get that experimentation and learning to understand these different strategies, something that might have taken you to hire a team or spend a few weeks to put something together to kind of show others And now you can do that much faster. And then you can also see, this test two, choose one process becomes even more richer when we can leverage these tools. And so I know we're now over the top of the hour, but it is something that Scott and myself and many of our colleagues, academic and practitioners are just putting into work to really allow folks to build and choose their strategy forward in a much richer and rewarding way.
Thank you for that. Exciting times indeed. And I'd like to thank you, Aaron, and you, Scott, for your time today, for really providing us, hopefully, with some very powerful takeaways and thoughts. I'd like to thank Julie and Elaine, my colleagues, for helping organize and host today's webinar. And finally, I'd like to thank all the participants that spent a little over an hour with us today learning about strategies for startups. I realize we didn't get to all your questions, but I hope that you'll be able to perhaps join us November 8th and 9th. I'll actually be working with Scott and Aaron on that program. So would really welcome the chance to have you join us in our virtual classroom to really go much deeper and to work more with Scott and Aaron and with the other participants that will be participating in the program. We're going to post the recording of today's webinar. If you scan the QR code, that will provide you with additional details on both that and other upcoming live events, other Innovation at Work webinars that we'll be hosting in the months to come. So with that, I'd like to bring today's webinar to a close. Thank you again, everybody, and we'll hope to see you back online again soon. Take care.